Hi there, it's John Moore here, and I am a shamanic teacher from Maine in the United States. And today I'm going to talk to you about shamanism, witchcraft, and paganism. What are the similarities and differences, a little bit about the history, etc. And I'm going to lead with a disclaimer here in that I do not consider myself an expert in witchcraft, and maybe not an expert in paganism either, although I probably know a lot more about that. But I do have some expertise in shamanism. I have been practicing shamanism for many, many years. I'm teaching and practice shamanism as a healer. And so I'm going to talk about it from my current perspective. If you are somebody who practices witchcraft or are practicing pagan, and I say something that strikes you wrong, I apologize in advance. It's not my intention to disrespect anybody's form of spirituality. I just want to highlight the fact that there can be some confusion over these terms from people who don't practice, who are maybe outside, or maybe people who are just wondering what these things are. So I have lots of videos about what is shamanism, and I'll put a link to one of them, I don't know, up there somewhere. And you can find out more about what shamanism is. But shamanism is what many people consider the oldest form of spirituality known to man. It might go back hundreds of thousands of years, although we don't have records there. It's definitely prehistoric. We see evidence of it in cultures well before any documented religion or spiritual practice. We see evidence in cave paintings. We see, and it's continuous. So there are cultures that practice shamanism today. And I am a shamanic practitioner, although I am a modern, shamanic practitioner without a direct connection to an indigenous culture. I did not grow up inside an indigenous culture, and though I may have relatives and ancestors from different indigenous cultures, I don't have a cultural connection to them. So, but in many places, such as in Siberia, Mongolia, South America, or even North America, there are, and Africa certainly, and Australia and Pacific Islands, there are unbroken lines of culture where shamanism is still practiced today and has been since before written records. If we look just at the Aboriginal culture in Australia, probably the oldest continual culture in the world. I believe it's considered that. Not records, but, anthropologically, we can go back, 40, 50, 60, 70,000 years. I'm not sure. The timeline keeps getting pushed back. And there are shamanic practices there. So there are people practicing shamanism. Their word for it will be different because, of course, that word isn't necessarily universal. But the way that we use it in English and the practices that we describe that are shamanic are we just label it. We label it shamanism because we don't have a better word for it in English. But shamanism is basically the use, it's a constellation of beliefs and practices. The first part of that is this sort of animistic belief that there is spirit everywhere, and everything living has a spirit, and sometimes everything that is even non-living, like rocks and things that we consider non-living, like rocks and mountains and the earth and that sort of thing, have their own spirits, and that's pretty common. And then the other component is the use of altered states of consciousness, travel in non-ordinary realms, so soul travel, and the work with helping spirits, whatever that means for the particular culture. But you might have heard of like power animals, or other helping spirits, spirit teachers, spirit guides, that sort of thing. And so those three components, along with the surrounding beliefs and a connection to nature and all these things that sort of comprise shamanism. And like I said, it's a constellation of practices, and it is often seen through a cultural lens, meaning, in South America, for example, they might be doing, an indigenous culture might be doing shamanic practices, but they're using their own language. They might be doing different prayers. They might enter altered states using plant medicine, where other cultures use drumming or some or dancing or what have you. So some of the methods might be a little bit different, but the practices are the same. So that's shamanism, kind of in a nutshell. That is many, many years of shamanic education and practice condensed into about 5 minutes. So let's talk about witchcraft a little bit, and that is a much, much more complicated topic. If you grew up in the Western world, or even in some other places, your concept of what a witch or what witchcraft is probably tainted by bad propaganda. We had witch trials in what is now the United States. It was a British colony before that. Fortunately, I guess, only, less than a couple dozen people were killed, but hundreds of people were jailed and people's property was taken and all this stuff. And probably none of those people were witches. Probably none of those people were doing what we consider witchcraft. It was political. It was financial. They used it to steal people's land and take their property. So in Europe, we have no idea how many people were killed. It might have been millions. And again, it was mostly political and financial, on the part of the church. Unfortunately, we have things like the Inquisition and the witch trials, and burning people at the stake for heresy and all kinds of stuff where political, religious violence took place. And so a lot of what we consider, and still filters through into this culture. If you think about the Wizard of Oz, although it did represent a good witch, there was the wicked witch with the pointed hat and the green skin riding the broom. And we have the movie The Witch, made in the US about, family living during US colonial times. And, the witches were, taking and killing babies and stuff like that. So there still is this cultural propaganda going on. It still filters through today, which is crazy. It's hundreds and hundreds of years later, and we're still living through that. However, in most places we have religious freedom, and we have the freedom to practice as we see fit. And so some people practice witchcraft, and there are different, lots of different flavors of that, obviously. And again, that is sort of practiced through cultural lens. So the best way I can describe witchcraft is, it is a form of folk magic, right? It is a form of using spiritual methods to affect reality. Now, that being said, during the 20th century, the religion of Wicca was formed, and there are, people who are clergy within Wicca, and people get married, and, I'm not sure about the organizational structure, but somebody actually took, as a reconstruction of folk belief. Now, we, unfortunately don't have a lot of historic records that we could consider truthful about the practices of folk magic, because, again, political and religious propaganda would have you believe that anybody practicing witchcraft was in league with the devil and eating babies and all of these sorts of things. Is there overlap between, say, shamanism and witchcraft? And the answer to that is probably yes. There probably were, definitely belief in spirits is there, but were witches doing shamanic journeys? And the answer to that is probably yes. And they were probably, what we consider European witches. And really the word witch comes from the root, comes from the origin of the word witch, or witchcraft comes from term meaning wise or wise person. So, these were probably pre-Christian people who were practicing magic and doing divination and guiding people and sort of a spiritual functionary in the same way that shamans are even today. We do think that there was probably the use of hallucinogenic plants, and which is taking flight is probably a reference to something very similar to a shamanic journey. So yeah, there's probably a lot of overlap. I personally know people who are Wiccan who also practice shamanism, and those things blend really well. And I do think that shamanism blends well with a lot of beliefs, because shamanism isn't a religion. It is, again, a bunch of beliefs and practices that are, that some people have in common all over the world. Let's talk about paganism for a minute. So paganism is a little bit easier to look at, because even though pagan temples were destroyed, pagan documents and writings were burned, there still are quite a lot of existing records for pagan practices. For example, we have the Greek magical papyri, which contains hymns and the Orphic hymns, and we have writings about certain pagan rites. So I'm just talking about the Greeks in this point, but there are lots of pagan cultures. So paganism is sort of, we might consider it pre-Christian polytheistic belief. And yes, there are pagans still today. There are post-Christian pagans, but paganism is, essentially polytheism from pre-Christian era. And so there are lots of forms of paganism, obviously. Belief in multiple gods and goddesses, and the spirit world, and all kinds of stuff. But yeah, we have a lot of records, particularly from the Greeks and Romans, about belief and practice during that time. Now, is there an overlap between witchcraft and paganism and shamanism? And my answer to that is probably yes, or actually definitely yes. So in excavating and doing archaeological work and anthropological work, we find a lot of hexes, spells, and cursing, and appeals to gods, and magical implements, and that sort of thing, in pagan cultures that even no longer exist. And so those things are, they're magical. We might consider them, a lot of them are folk magic, and so very heavily overlapping with what we would consider witchcraft. And some people might actually consider it witchcraft. And if you believe the propaganda, they were all in league, the religious propaganda, they were all in league with the devil. How does paganism overlap with shamanism? Very closely, actually. And we know for a fact that in many cultures they were communing with the gods in ways, sometimes using hallucinogenic chemicals. So there are records of the, and I'm gonna probably mispronounce this, but the mysteries of Eleusis, the Eleusinian mysteries. And this was a mystery school or a temple that existed in Greece for over 1,000 years. So imagine a single church that had existed for 1,000 years. Now we have some old churches in Europe, 700 years, and those things are ancient, but this was like a continuously operating process, and tens of thousands of pagans went to this temple and undertook a ritual and drank something called kakon. And kakon is a type of beer, and it probably was infused with ergot. And ergot is a type of fungus from which we derive LSD, right? So they were all tripping, and they went through, they were in this temple, and it was probably dark, and there was flames, and there might have been, we don't know exactly what they did, but they were drinking this hallucinogenic beer and communing with the gods. And the experiences they describe are what we might refer to as entheogenic, meaning they embodied godhood. They had a firsthand experience of gods. And people who write about this, or who wrote about this back then, talk about it being an absolutely life-altering experience. And shamanic shamanic practice is very much like that. So they were doing some kind of journeying there. So there is a lot of overlap. And obviously, again, I'm referring to the Greeks only because that's the area of paganism where I have the most knowledge, but there were pagans everywhere. There were Norse pagans, and they certainly practiced shamanism, primarily women, but also men, but it was primarily women who practiced Seth in the Scandinavia areas and the Norse areas. And Seth is shamanic journeying. And there are shamanic cultures still. The Sami tribes in the north of North Scandinavia, the indigenous tribes there, still practice shamanism today. So there's a long history there. Multiple gods and goddesses, so it's paganism. But yeah, I refer to the Greeks a lot because that's where I have the most knowledge of paganism. But there are lots and lots of cultures where this happened, and so there is a lot of overlap between these three, and it can sort of understand why there can be some confusion. And to add to that confusion, people tend to use a lot of these words differently, right? Like there is a lot of academic disagreement about the definition, the description of shamanism and what shamanism means. There are some accepted definitions, but there's academic disagreement about what it means, and but they're all pretty close. They've sort of honed in on it. They've sort of honed in on what the practice of shamanism is. Witchcraft is a lot more complicated, and again, it's a label that people who were practicing in ancient times what we now call witchcraft probably didn't call it that. They probably called it something else, and there were sort of like for example, there were wise people in the area that's now the UK who were experts at fending off spells. They were professionals, and you would go to them and you would pay them, probably maybe not in money, but with chickens or what have you, to fend off magical attacks from other people, or to undo curses, or to undo bad luck and that sort of thing. But they didn't use the word witch, and so that word is complicated. It carries a lot of cultural baggage because it was used as a term of propaganda, as I said, as religious and political propaganda, to take people's money, to put women down. It was used as a way to kill women who stepped out of line. Absolutely horrific history for many years. It's terrible. So anyway, I'm going to wrap this up, but that is a very quick overview of witchcraft, shamanism, and paganism, and how they might overlap, interact, be similar, be different, and those kinds of things. And I would encourage you, if you have questions about witchcraft, talk to somebody who practices witchcraft. If you have questions about shamanism, talk to somebody who practices shamanism. If you have questions about paganism, talk to somebody who practices paganism. I, for one, am always happy to talk about my practice. I love it. I love spreading it. I'm not going to proselytize or try to convert anybody. That is not what we do. But I am happy to educate. I'm happy to converse. I'm happy to exchange information. I think that makes us all better in the end. With that, I will leave you. I hope you're happy and healthy, and I will talk to you real soon.